the body was engulfed. Dance waited just long enough to be certain there'd be nothing recognizable left. Carrying the trash bag, he left the room, locked the door, and walked down the hall to the fire alarm. He broke the glass and pulled the alarm lever. Then he took the stairs down to the ground floor. From an alley across the street, he watched the flames shoot from his window. The hotel was evacuated, and the street filled with sleepy-eyed people wrapped in blankets. Through the knot of people, Dance spotted a black limousine crawling slowly down the street. He recognized the man sitting in the back seat. So, the CIA was here. Interesting. But he had seen enough. It was late, and he needed to be on his way, back to Amsterdam. He'd done what he had come to Berlin to do. He'd killed off Geoffrey Fontaine. Now it was time to vanish. Amsterdam. The old man was awakened at 3 a.m. with the news. Geoffrey Fontaine is dead.
How?
Asked the old man. A hotel fire. They say he was smoking in bed.
An accident? Impossible. Where is the body?
Berlin morgue, very badly burned. Of course, thought the old man. He should have known the body would not be recognizable. Simon Dance, as usual, had done a superb job of covering his tracks. So, they had lost him again. But the old man still had one card to play.
You told me there was an American wife. Where does she live?
Washington.
I will have her followed.
But why? I just told you the man's dead.
He's not dead. And this woman may know where he is. I want her watched.
I'll have my men.
No. I will send my own man, someone I can count on.
There was a pause. I will get you her address. After he'd hung up, the old man could not go back to sleep. For 5 years he'd waited. For 5 years he'd been searching. To have come so close, only to fail again. Now everything depended on what this woman in Washington knew. He had to be patient and wait for her to betray herself. Washington. It was after midnight when the telephone rang. Through a heavy curtain of sleep, Sarah heard it ring. She struggled to wake up. She had to answer the phone. She knew her husband Geoffrey was calling. It was Wednesday night, and on his monthly trips to London, Geoffrey always called home on Wednesday. Tonight, however, Sarah had crawled into bed early, sniffling and coughing, a victim of the latest flu virus to hit Washington. It was influenza A63 from Hong Kong, a particularly miserable strain that she now shared with half her colleagues in the microbiology lab. For an hour she'd sat up reading in bed, fighting valiantly to stay awake. But the combination of a cold capsule plus the most recent Journal of Microbiology had worked faster than any sleeping pill. Within minutes she'd fallen back on the pillows with her glasses still perched on her nose. She woke with a start as the phone rang again. Eagerly she grabbed the receiver. "Mrs. Sarah Fontaine?" asked a man's voice. It wasn't Geoffrey. Sudden alarm shot through her like a jolt of electricity. Something was terribly wrong. She sat up at once, fully awake. "Yes, speaking." "Mrs. Fontaine, this is Nicholas O'Hara, U.S. State Department. I'm sorry to call you at this hour, but I'm afraid I have some bad news. It's about your husband, Geoffrey. There's been an accident." Sarah closed her eyes. This isn't real, she thought. If Geoffrey were hurt, I would have felt it. Somehow I would have known. The man continued speaking. "It happened about 6 hours ago. There was a fire in your husband's hotel. I'm sorry to tell you this, Mrs. Fontaine. Your husband, he didn't make it." He allowed her a moment of silence, a moment in which she struggled to contain her grief. It was a stupid, irrational act of pride, that made her press her hand over her mouth to stifle the sob. This pain was too private to share with any stranger. At last she managed to take a shaky breath. "Mrs. Fontaine, are you all right?" "Yes. You don't have to worry about the arrangements. I'll coordinate all the details with our consulate in Berlin. There'll be a delay, of course, but once the German authorities clear the body's release." She broke in. "Did you say Berlin?" "It's in their jurisdiction, you see. There'll be a full report as soon as the Berlin police—" She broke in again. "But this isn't possible. Jeffrey was in London." A long silence followed her words. When he spoke at last, it was in an irritatingly calm voice. "Mrs. Fontaine, the accident occurred in Berlin." "Then they've made a mistake. Jeffrey was in London. He couldn't have been in Germany." Again there was a pause, longer this time. Sarah could tell the man was puzzled. "Mrs. Fontaine, which hotel was he staying at in London?" The Savoy." "Let me do some calling around. Perhaps I should see you in the morning. Can you come by my office?" How do I find it?" "I'll have a car sent by." "It's a mistake, isn't it? I mean, you do make mistakes, don't you?" A bit of hope, that was all she was asking him for. Some small thread to cling to. At least he could have given her that much. He could have shown her a little kindness. But all he said was, "I'll see you in the morning, Mrs. Fontaine, around 11. Nick O'Hara drained his third cup of coffee and jerked his tie loose. He'd been back in Washington only 3 days, and already he was edgy. Vacations were supposed to recharge the old batteries. That's why he'd gone to the Bahamas. He'd spent 2 glorious weeks doing absolutely nothing except lie around half-naked in the sun. He'd needed the time to be alone, to ask himself some hard questions and come to some conclusions. But the only conclusion he'd reached was that he was unhappy. After 8 years with the State Department, Nick O'Hara was fed up with his job. He was headed in circles, a ship without a rudder. His career was at a standstill, but the fault was not entirely his. Bit by bit, he'd lost his patience for political games of state. He wasn't in the mood to play. He'd hung in there, though, because he'd believed in his job, in its intrinsic worth, from peace marches in his youth to peace tables in his prime. But ideals he had discovered got people nowhere. Hell, diplomacy didn't run on ideals. It ran like everything else on protocol and party-line politics. While he'd perfected his protocol, he hadn't gotten the politics quite right. It wasn't that he couldn't. He wouldn't. In that regard, Nick knew he was a lousy diplomat. Unfortunately, those in authority apparently agreed with him. So he had been banished to this bottom-of-the-barrel consular post in D.C., calling bad news to new widows. It was a not-so-subtle slap in the face. Sure, he could have refused the assignment. He could have gone back to teaching, to his comfortable old niche as associate professor of linguistics at American University. He had needed to think about it. Yes, he'd needed those 2 weeks alone in the Bahamas. What he didn't need was to come home to this. With a sigh, he flipped open the file labeled Fontaine, Jeffrey H. Since 1 a.m., he'd been staring at a computer terminal, digging out everything he could get from the vast government files. He'd also spent half an hour on the phone with his buddy Wes Corrigan in the Berlin consulate. In frustration, he'd finally turned to a few unusual sources. What had started off as a routine call to the widow to give her his regrets was turning into something a bit more complicated, a puzzle for which Nick didn't have all the pieces. Nick didn't like incomplete puzzles. They drove him crazy. He leaned back in his chair and yawned. When he was 20 and in college, staying up half the night used to give him a high. Now that he was 38, it only made him crotchety. And hungry. At 6 a.m., he'd wolfed down 3 donuts. The surge of sugar into his system, plus the coffee, had been enough to keep him going.